Hello, and welcome to the Get Creative with Cadimage Tools webinar. Cadimage has a great lineup of productivity tools, but today we're going to be focusing on three that assist with your design and creativity: doors and windows, coverings, and cabinets. First up, doors and windows. There's a lot that could be said about this tool, scheduling for example, but today I'm going to demonstrate how it can be used to design doors and windows. Before we get too far into the tool, an obvious first question might be, why provide more doors and windows when ARCHICAD has a built-in library? Let's just take a look in the door tool. We can see that ARCHICAD provides an extensive range of door and window objects, and we're not seeking to replicate that. Notice that each of these objects implicitly makes some key design decisions for you. Primarily its layout and selection of components. With the single door picked, there's a lot of things I can change about its appearance, but it's never going to be anything other than just a single door. If I want to add a side light, for example, I have to look for another object. And it can take a while with experimentation and trying different objects to get just the right thing that you want. And if at the end of that you still can't find it, you might be able to achieve that by cobbling together different doors, ganging them together in the model. And that causes other problems like scheduling. That's a different subject. And if the style or manufacturer just isn't in this range, I'm out of luck unless I search for a completely separate library. And while this is adequate in many ways, it feels a little bit like cookie-cutter architecture. Cadimage is trying to provide a completely different experience, and you can see this immediately when you look at our library, where we've got just a single object for the door, or in the window tool, just a single object for the window. And yet this is unlike the other objects. This is a design tool, and it's capable of making all of those other types of windows that you see in the ARCHICAD library, and many others besides. Just to illustrate that, with that window selected, I can immediately divide that into two. I can add a top row above it, insert a panel in the window itself, or insert a bottom row, and immediately we have something that looks entirely different than the starting point. I'm going to use a basic model to illustrate how these creative design tools can be used, starting with doors and windows. So I'm going to make a couple of doors for these sides of the buildings. Let's start with the window. The overall bounding size can be set like any other window. I'll switch this to an elevation view so we can see what happens to the shape as I edit it. As an aside, you can see that I'm working with metric units, primarily millimeters, but this works just the same way in imperial units. Now let's start with the overall window shape. You can see that we've got a wide variety of things that can be edited. And we can quickly see how this approach varies from the standard ARCHICAD library, where I can pick a head shape for the window falling in one direction or the other, or a shape for the bottom. This approach is effectively combining the characteristics that you might have to derive from many different Graphisoft windows, but combines it into a single object. I'll be specifying just a shape for the head for this demo. Now I want to divide this window into 4 sections of 800 mils, and I'd like either side of it to be level. So I'll start by setting level on either side for 800 mils, and then the rising section in the middle I'd like to be 400. Now you can see that the angle immediately updates when I set the rise. Those two are interactive, so changing one automatically updates the other. Now I'd like the top part of this window to be just a fixed panel. So I'm going to set that to 400, and we can see that a transom is inserted along the top. Now I'll switch to the glazing panels to divide up the lower section. If I select this panel and click plus, we can see that it divides it in two. If I keep doing that process, we see that it's now divided into the 4 panels. Each of these panels is independently selectable, and each one can also contain a unique type of component. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to pick a completely different option for each panel. Let's say the first one will be a left slider, and we'll make the next one a right slider, we'll go for a double hung window here, but in this case I don't want the opening to occupy the whole height. I'd like to have a panel underneath it, so I'm going to insert a panel below. Now with that panel selected, I can change that to louvers. I'd like the last panel to be a door, so we'll go for left hung door. Now again, I don't want this to be the full height. 2.4 meters is a bit high for a door, so I'll insert a panel above. And just for interest, let's say that that is an awning window. Now if I wanted to control the height of those panels that I have, I could go back to the shape and say, for example, that I would like that top panel to be 400 and the panel at the bottom should be, say, 500, and we can immediately see that updated in the preview. Now I'll move on to the door leaf. I'd like the panel to look like this, and now I'd like to pick the surfaces. I'll just move to a 3D view so we can see what we're getting. Now overall, I'll just go for a white door, but I'd like the panel in that to be glazed. If I move on to all attributes, in general I'd like the surfaces to remain as is. But I'd like the main frame to the outside to be white. There's a lot more detail that we could cover, looking at the hardware, detailing the frame, the glass, and the trims. But time's moving on and we don't have time to look into all of those details. But I think this gives you a reasonable impression of what it's capable of. Now placement of the window works just like any other ARCHICAD object. I'll click first to indicate the position, and then again for the orientation, and we can see our finished unit in 2D and in 3D. Now, without the Doors and Windows tool, we could have possibly made something like this by ganging pieces together, perhaps assembling 2 to 3 different doors. I think we'd have had some trouble making this, but what you'd end up with is something that was fundamentally different pieces, and so editing that, moving it, scheduling it would all become problematic. And the interface for each of those objects would vary slightly. Now I'll quickly demonstrate the same for the Door tool. I won't go into as much detail in this case. A lot of the principles are exactly the same as the window. Overall, I'd like my door to be 2040 high. There are many shape options, but for the purpose of this exercise I won't go through them all. I'll just move straight on to the door type. I want a single swing. But I'd like a leaf on both sides, so I get a double door. I'll skip over the options for glazing panels, they're numerous, and move on to the door leaf. I would like this type of leaf. And I'll set all the surfaces to white. And again, I want the panel to be glazed. And if I move on to all attributes, I'll also make the exterior white. As with the window, there's many other characteristics that I can specify. Hardware, frame, glazing, and the trims. But time's ticking away, and I'll place that as it is. And there we have our finished door and window. Altogether, there's innumerable combinations of doors and windows that you can make with this tool, but that should give you a good feel for its potential. Now I'll move on to coverings. This tool is all about representing cladding or finishes realistically in the model, and we'll look at examples using slabs, roofs, and walls. I'll use this slab as a simple example. Say I wanted timber decking. There's 2 ways I could approach that with ARCHICAD. If I wanted a simple rendering of this material, I could just apply a surface texture. So if I open the settings, I could pick something like wood deck. And that's okay, but it's not very convincing. Even if we had a better texture, it's not going to contribute anything to my sections or details, where it will look like pretty much any other slab. So I'll undo that for now. Alternatively, I could model the decking by making a profile for the boards, multiplying them across the slab, and trimming them to match the shape of the slab. I'm not going to demonstrate that because it takes a while, and that's the main disadvantage of it. And of course, if the design changes, you're going to have to redo the whole process all over again. But with coverings, you can get the best of both approaches. First, it's really quick. It can be much quicker than messing around with surfaces and texture images. If you've ever tried to do that to make a really convincing presentation rendering, you'll know exactly what I mean. All I need to do is to select the slab and click Cadimage Coverings and Slab Coverings. I've got a couple of options for the type of covering I could apply. So we've got a precast slab with a number of different common profile types. And we've got the Cadimage decking, which is the option that I want in this case. And you can see I've got a wide variety of options here. So I have two different profiles, for example, a flat or reeded. I'll go for the reeded in this case. And I can choose square grooves or rounded. I think I'll stick with the square. And I'll put a 5mm spacing between my boards. And I can pick a relevant surface. I'll just go for wood. And some suitable pens. I have just a black outline. And when I click OK, the covering is applied to the slab. Now I have a representation that was really quick to make and looks great in renderings and construction documents right down to the detail level. So if I click on that and isolate it, we can see that this is a full model element that will contribute to all my construction documentation. And better still, it handles design changes automatically. So if I reshape my slab, we can see that as I make these changes, the covering is automatically responding. So I get good visualization and a better BIM project with a minimum of effort. The advantages become clear when we look at the cladding on a roof. So if I wanted this roof to be tiled, I could just look at the settings again and I could pick some kind of roof tile texture. But as before, this isn't really very convincing. It looks quite flat, and in particular it's lacking any construction detailing for a tile roof, for example along the ridge or the hips. And if I cut sections through it, the surface texture contributes nothing. It's just a skin, as if it's painted on the surface. And presenting something like this would be a bit of an embarrassment. It looks quite basic and crude. So I'll undo that and we'll apply a covering instead. So if I select my roof, Cadimage coverings and roof coverings this time, This is where the power of this tool really stands out. As you can see, these settings are about a lot more than just applying a surface texture or a skin to the roof. This covers every aspect of your construction detailing. I'll start with the cladding. I can pick from a range of common roofing materials, and if I go through some of these, you can see they each provide their own illustration and setup. So corrugate, flat, ribbed, shingles, and a variety of tiles. I want the tiles, and I'll just check that we have an appropriate surface and pen. Then we can move on to framing, and here I can specify the structure supporting the tiles. I'll stick with the timber battens, but common steel sections are also supported, and all the setout dimensions can be specified. I'll quickly step through some of these options. I have full control over the size and materials of other roof members, including the fascia, the barge, the ridge, details of the flashing, including again barge and hip. I'll stick with the tiles to match the rest of the roof. For my apron flashings, which will become important later, I'll pick a metal. The tool can also place all the gutters around my roof. I'll go for a half round. And finally, the downpipes. I'll just stick with the defaults for now. Clearly there are a number of other settings, but I won't go into the details of all of them, so time is short. So I'll click OK, and here's our roof. Just like the deck, we now have a rendering of the surface which is much more convincing, but more importantly, notice that we've got all the detailing that usually goes with the roof. So we have our ridge tiles and our hips. And we can see fascias and barges and gutters run around the perimeter. Now you might notice there's one thing missing, the downpipes. The tool doesn't really understand where these should be placed, so it's up to me to indicate where I'd like them, but it uses the settings that I entered earlier. So if I select covering, the eaves edges always have a special hotspot. If I click on that and drag, I can pull across the downpipe. And then if I grab the bottom of that, there's another spot there, and I can take that down to the ground. And I could repeat that wherever else I'd like a downpipe. The tool has full settings for adjusting the size and setout and so on of the downpipe, but that's enough to illustrate it for now. So with a minimum of effort, I have a quite convincing roof structure, complete with gutters and downpipes. If I'd stuck with simple surface textures, the model would have been left looking a bit vacant, and it's not really very convincing, but modeling all of this detail takes a lot of time, and the roof on this building alone would have taken in excess of an hour. I'll also clad this other roof here, and I'm doing it separately because it presents a bit of a challenge. I'll use exactly the same settings as before. And most of this is fine. But if we look closely at this back edge, the tool hasn't been certain what's happening here, and it's treated as a gable edge. But I really need an apron flashing along here. The first step is to divide these roof planes into different segments so that I can specify different detailing along this edge. So if I pick up my roof planes, I'll add some additional nodes. And then if I select my coverings, and go to coverings and edit roof edges, I get an illustration of all the selected roof coverings, and it labels the type and detail for each edge, so we can see that the eaves are currently set to a gutter. And if I pick up these edges here, they're currently set to being a barge, but I would like that to be an apron. So if we zoom up, we can see that that small edge there is still a barge, and this edge adjacent or abutting the wall is now an apron flashing. So now we get the correct detailing along the edge of the roof. And this finished result isn't just good for presentation images. Your elevations, sections, and details will all look good too. So now I'll move on to clad the walls. Like the roofs, I'll do this in two parts. So first I'll pick up all the two-story walls, and this time we'll use Cadimage coverings and wall coverings. Just like the roof coverings, this provides a wide array of detailing options. I'll start at the configuration. Now the purpose of this is to say how many materials I'd like to apply to the wall and what the setout is for them. So I could just go for single cladding, so the whole wall would be the same material, or I can split them at various points like the sill or the head or both, or various options like splitting below openings or above openings. So every combination is represented. I'll just go for splitting at the sill level, and this means that if I look at my menu, I can now specify a main covering for the bulk of the wall and the covering that appears below the sill height. Now before I leave the configuration, I should set that sill height, and then move on to the main covering. And as for the roofs, there's a lot of different materials I can pick from. And as before, each of these provides key setup dimensions. I'll go for the board and battens and pick some appropriate materials. And pens, and I'll set it to be vertical cladding, and for the rest I'll use the defaults. And then for the covering below the sill, there are other details that I can fill in, but I'll skip that now for brevity. For this, I'll pick the bricks and blocks. I'll go for a slightly larger spacing. Check my materials and pens. Now there's many other options I can look at. Horizontal trims, and the detailing around openings. Lots and lots of detail here. I'll just quickly add a sill profile at the median between the sill covering and the main covering. And I'll just quickly check the rest of my pens. It all looks fine. Now the tool's prompting me to specify whether this covering should be applied to the inside of the walls or to the outside. This is an exterior cladding, so I'll click outside. And we can see that it's placed cladding around the perimeter of the selected walls. If we look in 3D, we can see that it's also been applied there. Now I can see that I've missed one of my pen settings. I seem to have a purple line in here. We've added an extra tool for every type of covering that's used by Cadimage covering. So if I want to select all of those, like any other tool, I can click on it and use Select All. And there's our pen. And now apply the same to the remaining walls. This has to be done in plan, so I can pick the outside or inside. I'll leave the settings as they are. And again, I can pick inside or outside. And we're done. Now there's a few areas where I could tidy this up. For example, my gutter is running through my cladding here, but they can all be easily adjusted. For the purposes of this demo, you can see that with the minimum of effort, I've greatly improved the detailing on my BIM model. And better still, with coverings, I've added this in a way that as I edit my model and the design changes, it works interactively with me. And finally, I'll add a kitchen unit to my model using cabinets. Before I get into the details of cabinets, I should probably point out that Cadimage adds a number of tools to the standard toolbar. If you don't see these, and ARCHICAD won't show them by default, go up to your Options menu, Work Environment, and Toolbox Settings. If you scroll down the list of tools, you should find our tools there. Select them. You'll probably want to add them to your design group, so click on that, and then click Add Selected. And then you should see all our tools appear in your toolbar. Now there's many parallels between cabinets and doors and windows. For example, if we look inside ARCHICAD's object tool and look at the cabinets that are provided with the standard library, you have a good range, but we see the same problem as the doors and windows. You have a fixed range to pick from, and even though they're variable to an extent, your cabinets end up looking a bit generic. So many resort to making their cabinets from other bits and pieces, say from slabs, walls, and other objects, but that's pretty time consuming, especially if the design keeps changing. So, like doors and windows, our cabinet tool is for design, where you can mix and match components to get the exact combination you're after. I'll start by opening the tool settings. And once again you can see that there's very little to choose from. In fact, primarily one. This is the full Cadimage cabinet, and that's for designing entire unit. The others can be used for partial units or assembling a cabinet from different modules. For example, the Cadimage doors and drawers does just what it says, the facing for a cabinet without any of the carcass. This is useful if you've simply block modelled your cabinet with slabs and you want to illustrate some doors and drawers on it. Likewise, you can add more detail to a block model or extend a cabinet with the cabinet end panel or the cabinet pelmet. But focusing on the cabinet itself, as for our other tools, there's a huge amount of detail available. We'll start with the base unit. This is where we broadly define the overall shape, and we can pick, say, rectangular, interior corner, exterior corner. I'll stick with the rectangular to start with, and I'll pick some of the primary surfaces. I'll take wood, but I think for the plinth I'll use a darker colour. Now, every unit can be divided into two modules, one of which can be a repeating series of identical bays. That division can be specified as a fixed length for each bay, or a number of instances. If I set the number of bays to 3, I have 2 in the left module and 1 in the right. And note that the pivot lines are illustrated on the doors. Now, if I switch to modules, I can specify the cabinet content. I'll keep the doors to the left, but I'll have a drawer above, 185 deep. You can see that added there. Now, these materials are a bit hard to see. I'll just quickly change those to something a little bit more visible and resume on modules. And I'll set the opening angle to 90 degrees on those doors so we can see what's happening inside. And I'll make this slightly more reasonable width. And on the right, I'll go for drawers, but rather than just one, I'll have 4. And now we have the overall set out in our unit. There's a lot of other detail that I could go into about the construction of the cabinet carcass, but I'll just gloss over it quickly. With the walls, there's options for how the walls relate to the base and which ones are visible. I'll turn off the right end, so now we can see into the drawers. Shelves, I could, for example, pick 2 shelves rather than 1, and I'll leave them at equal spacing, but I could customize that if I like. Then there's the base and plinth, which of these are required and what toe holds we need. And finally the face and frame, how the face connects to the frame of the carcass behind. I'll just leave that on a surface mount. Next I'll go on to the counter settings. We can actually turn off the whole bench top and put, if we wanted to put something else in its place. We have all the setup dimensions you could possibly require. I'll also set the surface to, say, a stainless steel. Then for the counter upstand, again there are many setup dimensions. and I'll have an upstand just to the back, and we'll quickly look at some details for the handles. I'll have a simple loop, and I'll leave all the other settings as they are, except I don't want a green pen. Finally, I'd better check my other pens. If I put it into a plain view, I can see what I'm going to get. And I think that's all fine. So I can place that in plan. Now I'll go through that again, but I'll just quickly select a corner unit this time. Now I could go through all the details of configuring this to be completely different than the one we just designed, but for the sake of brevity I'll just leave this as is, but I think you get the idea from what I've shown of how configurable that is. This corner unit works in exactly the same way. The only difference is that on the walls I'll take off the left side as well, so that it's open to connect on both sides. Get that in the right orientation. And there we have our finished unit. And if I put a marquee around that, and we look at that in 3D, there we have our finished unit. Using the available modules with cabinets and the design abilities, I can make pretty much any arrangement of cabinets I like. The possibilities are endless. I could also mount sinks, cookers and so on into the counters, but I think that gives you a good impression of the tool's potential. And that's the end of our session. Thanks for watching.